At my brother's bachelor party, my dad said, "You're paying for his honeymoon because he needs a fresh start." And I said, "Then read the trust letter I brought." I knew my dad was going to ask me for money that night. I just didn't know he was going to do it in front of 23 people while everyone was drinking, and my brother was standing there pretending he had no idea what was happening. The bachelor party was being held at a rented event room attached to a sports bar, and I had already spent most of the evening trying not to think about the fact that I had brought a folder with me. It wasn't a normal folder. It contained a copy of a trust letter, several bank statements, and a few pages from the estate attorney who had handled my grandmother's affairs. I had brought it because I had a feeling the subject of money was going to come up. I didn't know exactly how. My younger brother, Ethan, was getting married in 3 weeks. He was 31, I was 35. Our dad had always treated Ethan like the kid who needed one more chance, one more loan, one more rescue, and one more explanation. I had spent most of my adult life pretending that didn't bother me. That night, I finally stopped pretending. The first time my dad approached me, I was standing near the bar checking the time on my phone. My wife, Megan, wasn't there because this was supposed to be a guy's night, although she had known I was nervous about it. She had actually asked me twice that afternoon if I wanted to bring the folder at all. I told her I probably wouldn't need it. That turned out to be only partly true. My dad walked over with a beer in one hand, and that particular expression he used when he had already decided what he wanted and was waiting for the right moment to make it sound reasonable. He asked if I had a minute. I followed him toward the hallway because I didn't want to have the conversation in front of everybody. That was my first mistake. I should have known there was a reason he wanted privacy. He told me Ethan was stressed. The wedding had cost more than expected. The honeymoon had become a problem. My dad had apparently been thinking about it for several weeks. Then he told me that since I was doing well financially, I should cover the honeymoon. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He explained that Ethan needed a fresh start. That was the phrase he used. A fresh start. He said Ethan had made some mistakes over the past few years, but marriage was supposed to be a new beginning, and it would be embarrassing for him and his future wife to start their marriage worrying about money. I asked why that meant I was supposed to pay. My dad looked genuinely confused by the question. He said because I could. That was basically his entire argument. I told him I wasn't paying for a honeymoon. He became irritated almost immediately. He said I was making everything about myself. I reminded him that it was Ethan's wedding, not mine. He said this was exactly the problem. According to him, I had always been too focused on fairness. I remember that sentence because it was one of those things that sounded so ridiculous that I wasn't sure how to respond. He told me Ethan wasn't asking for a handout. He was asking for help. I asked him whether Ethan knew he was asking me. My dad paused. That pause told me enough. I said I wanted to hear it from Ethan directly. My dad told me not to embarrass him. I asked what was embarrassing about asking your brother for money. My dad got quiet. Then he said I was being difficult. I walked back into the room. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. About 20 minutes later, everyone was gathered around a long table because somebody had ordered food. People were laughing. Someone had started a slideshow of old pictures of Ethan. There was a picture of him at age 8, wearing a plastic firefighter helmet. Another showed him holding a baseball bat that was almost as tall as he was. Everyone was laughing and making jokes. I was actually enjoying myself for the first time that evening. Then my dad stood up. He tapped his glass with a fork. Everyone quieted down. He said he wanted to make a toast to Ethan. That sounded normal. What followed wasn't. My dad talked about how hard the past few years had been for Ethan. He mentioned the failed business. He mentioned the credit card debt. He mentioned how expensive the wedding had become. Then he said that every man deserved a fresh start when he got married. He looked directly at me. Then he said I had agreed to give Ethan and his fiancée the honeymoon as a wedding gift. For a second, nobody moved. I honestly thought I had misheard him. Then a couple people started clapping. Someone whistled. Ethan looked at me. He didn't look surprised. That was the moment something inside me changed. Until then, I had thought my dad was making an unreasonable request. I hadn't realized he had already told other people that I had agreed. I stood up. I said I had never agreed to pay for the honeymoon. The room went silent again. My dad's face changed. Ethan looked down at the table. One of his friends asked if there had been some misunderstanding. I said there hadn't. My dad tried to explain that we had discussed it privately. I said we had discussed him asking me. That wasn't the same thing as me agreeing. My dad told me I was making a scene. I reminded him that he had announced it publicly. He said I was humiliating Ethan. I said I was correcting something that had been falsely announced about me. That was when Ethan finally spoke. He said he thought I was going to help. I asked him why he thought that. He said Dad told him I had agreed. I looked at my dad. He wouldn't look at me. Then I understood something important. This wasn't a request anymore. It was a commitment my father had created on my behalf. and expected me to honor because refusing would make me look selfish. I sat back down. I didn't argue anymore. I told everyone that I wasn't paying for the honeymoon. Then I ate my dinner. It sounds strange, but that was the calmest I had felt all night. My dad didn't speak to me again for the rest of the party. Ethan left early. The next morning, my phone had 11 missed calls. 7 were from my dad, 3 were from Ethan. 1 was from my mother. I didn't answer any of them immediately. I made coffee. I went to work. I sat through 2 meetings. Then around lunch, I received a message from Ethan saying that I had ruined the bachelor party. He said he couldn't believe I would do that to him 3 weeks before his wedding. I asked him what exactly he thought I had ruined. He said the honeymoon. I reminded him that I had never promised to pay for it. He stopped responding. That should have been the end of the matter. Instead, it opened a much older problem. Our grandmother had died 11 months earlier. She was my mother's mother. She had been a practical woman who hated family arguments and hated debt even more. She had left behind a house, several investment accounts, and a small trust. My grandmother had always been very clear that she wanted things divided equally between my mother and her 2 children. Those 2 children were my mother and my uncle. My brother and I weren't direct beneficiaries of the main estate. However, there was a separate trust for me and Ethan that she had established years before. I knew about the trust. Ethan knew about it. My parents knew about it. What I didn't know was how much money was actually in it. The trust had been managed by an attorney because my grandmother didn't trust any of us to handle the money ourselves. Her exact reasoning had always been that she loved us too much to let us ruin each other over money. At the time, I thought that was just something old people said. After the bachelor party, I started wondering if she had known exactly what she was doing. The following Monday, I called the attorney's office. I wasn't trying to start a legal fight. I wanted to understand what the trust actually said. The attorney's assistant confirmed that my trust was still active. She also told me something I hadn't expected. There had been a recent request for information about the trust. She couldn't tell me everything over the phone, but she said the request had come from someone who wasn't a beneficiary. That immediately bothered me. I asked who. She said she couldn't discuss another person's communications without authorization. I understood. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I called my mother. She didn't answer. I called again that evening. Still nothing. Around 9, my dad called. I answered because I was tired of avoiding the conversation. He didn't apologize for the bachelor party. Instead, he told me I had embarrassed the family. I asked why he thought it was acceptable to announce that I was paying for something I had never agreed to. He said I had been selfish. Then he brought up my grandmother. He said she would have wanted me to help Ethan. I asked how he knew that. He said because she loved both of us. I said loving both of us didn't mean she wanted one of us to fund the other. He got angry. Then he said something that bothered me more than the argument itself. He said I needed to stop acting like the trust money was completely mine. I asked what he meant. He said the money was intended for both brothers. I told him I knew that. He said Ethan had already received less than I had. I asked how he knew what I had received. He said my grandmother had discussed it with him. That was possible, but something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. I opened the folder sitting on my desk. I had requested the trust documents months earlier, mostly because I wanted to understand how the distributions worked. There was a letter from the attorney explaining that each trust was separate. Each beneficiary had individual control over his own distributions once certain conditions were met. There was no provision requiring one brother to share with the other. I read that paragraph 3 times, then I noticed something else. There was a handwritten note attached to the copy my grandmother had given me. It wasn't technically part of the trust document. It was a letter she had written to me. I had forgotten about it. The letter was dated 2 years before she died. She had written that she hoped the money would give me stability, but she specifically warned me not to let family pressure turn the trust into a source of conflict. She said I was allowed to say no. That sentence hit me harder than I expected, not because it gave me permission. I already knew I could say no. It hurt because she had apparently expected exactly this kind of situation. The next morning, I called the attorney again. This time, I asked whether my father had ever been given information about my trust. The attorney said no. Then I asked whether there had been any attempt by my parents to access or alter the trust. There had been no successful attempt, but there had been a request. That was the first real clue. I asked what kind of request. The attorney explained that several months earlier, someone had contacted the office asking whether funds could be transferred between the 2 beneficiary accounts. The request had been rejected because the trusts were separate. I asked who made the request. This time, because I was a beneficiary and because the request concerned my trust, the attorney could tell me. It had been my father. I sat in my car for about 10 minutes after that call. I wasn't driving. I was just sitting there with the engine off. I kept thinking about all the times my dad had casually mentioned that Ethan was struggling. The car loan, the credit cards, the business debt, the wedding deposits, the apartment lease. I had assumed he was venting. Now I wondered whether he had been preparing me. My dad had known the trust existed. He had apparently tried to move money from mine to Ethan's. When that didn't work, he had shifted to asking me directly, and when I said no, he announced that I had agreed. That was a very different situation from a father asking his son for help. I called Megan. She listened while I explained everything. She didn't tell me what to do. She asked one question. She wanted to know whether I had any records of the conversations with my dad. I told her most of it had happened in person. She said that was okay. She reminded me that I didn't need to prove my feelings. I needed to document facts, so I started doing that. I wrote down the date of the bachelor party. I wrote down what my dad had asked. I wrote down what he had announced publicly. I saved the text messages from Ethan. I saved the missed calls. I saved every email related to the trust. I didn't record anyone secretly. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't post anything online. I just kept records. The next week, things became increasingly uncomfortable. My mother finally called. She was crying. She said my dad had made things worse than they needed to be. I asked her whether she knew about the trust. She said she knew there was money. I asked whether she knew Dad had contacted the attorney. There was a long silence. Then she admitted she did. She said Ethan had gotten into more debt than anyone realized. The wedding had already cost them almost $30,000 between deposits, travel, food, and other expenses. Some of that was being paid by his fiancé's family. Some was coming from my parents, and some was being charged to credit cards. I asked why they hadn't told me. My mother said they were embarrassed. I believed her. That was the difficult part. I didn't think my parents were evil. I didn't think Ethan was evil either. I thought they had gotten into a situation they couldn't control. But being in trouble didn't give them the right to decide that my money belonged to them. My mother told me that Ethan had been offered a fresh start by his future father-in-law. That confused me. She explained that his fiancé's family had agreed to help with some wedding expenses, but they didn't know about the full extent of Ethan's debt. If the debt became known, the wedding might be postponed. I asked whether Ethan's fiancé knew about the credit cards. My mother said she thought so. I asked whether she knew about the business debt. Another pause. She wasn't sure. That made my stomach drop. I had been thinking about a honeymoon. Suddenly, I was looking at a much bigger problem. I asked my mother whether Ethan had ever asked me for money directly. She said no. Then she started crying again. She said Dad had convinced himself that I would help if he framed it as a wedding gift. I told her that wasn't helping. She agreed. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said my grandmother had warned her about this. I asked what she meant. My mother told me that shortly before my grandmother died, she had privately told my mother not to let family members use the trust to keep Ethan out of trouble. My mother said she hadn't understood what she meant at the time. Now she did. I asked why she hadn't told me. She said she thought it would cause more conflict. I didn't know whether to be angry or sad. Probably both. A few days later, Ethan came to my house. I hadn't invited him. He showed up around 7 in the evening. I was making dinner. He looked exhausted. He had lost weight. His wedding was 3 weeks away, and I suddenly understood how much pressure he was under. I let him inside. We sat at the kitchen table. He didn't apologize immediately. He just stared at his hands. Eventually, he told me that he hadn't known how bad things had gotten. He said the business had failed 2 years earlier. He had personally guaranteed some of the debt. Then he had used credit cards to keep paying expenses. After that came late fees, then more cards. Then the wedding. He said he kept thinking he could fix everything after the wedding. I asked him whether his fiancée knew. He said she knew about some debt, but not all of it. I asked him why he thought I should pay for the honeymoon. He said Dad told him I had more than enough. That answer hurt. Not because it was financially inaccurate, because it reduced my entire life to a number. I told Ethan I wasn't going to give him money, but I also told him I wasn't going to abandon him. I said if he wanted help organizing the debt, I would sit with him and go through the numbers. If he wanted to speak to a credit counselor, I would help him find one. If he needed to delay the wedding, I would support that decision. But I wasn't going to give him money without knowing what the money was actually solving. He looked angry at first, then embarrassed. Eventually, he admitted he didn't even know the total amount he owed. That scared me. We spent nearly 3 hours going through his accounts. He had 6 credit cards, 2 personal loans, a business credit line, a car loan, and several overdue bills. The total was over $80,000. I stared at the spreadsheet. I understood immediately why my dad wanted access to the trust. The honeymoon wasn't the problem. It was barely a dent. My brother was standing on the edge of a financial cliff. My dad wasn't asking me to buy a vacation. He was trying to plug a hole with someone else's money. I asked Ethan what his plan was. He didn't have one. He said he thought getting married would make things easier. I told him marriage wasn't a financial reset button. He nodded. He looked like he already knew that. The next day, Ethan told his fiancée the full amount. I wasn't there. I only know because he called me afterward. The wedding was postponed 2 days later. My parents blamed me, at least at first. My dad said that if I had just paid for the honeymoon, none of this would have happened. I told him that was impossible. The debt existed before I knew about it. He said I had forced Ethan to confess. I told him Ethan had chosen to tell the truth. My dad said I had destroyed his son's wedding. I said his son's debt had done that. That ended the call. For several weeks, our family barely spoke. Ethan moved out of the apartment he shared with his fiancée temporarily. She stayed with her parents. They didn't break up. They started counseling. Ethan began working with a non-profit credit counselor. He sold the car he couldn't afford. He closed most of his credit cards. He took a second job on weekends. None of it was glamorous. There was no dramatic turnaround. He still owed a lot of money, but for the first time, he knew exactly what he owed. My parents were another story. My father became convinced that I had manipulated Ethan against the family. He told relatives that I had refused to help my own brother. Some relatives believed him. One aunt called me and asked why I couldn't just give Ethan $20,000. I asked whether she was willing to give him $20,000. She said she didn't have it. I told her I didn't either. She said I had inherited money. I asked how she knew that. She wouldn't answer. That was when I realized my dad had been talking. He had told people about the trust. He hadn't given them exact numbers, but he had told them enough to make me look selfish. I didn't defend myself publicly. That was difficult. I wanted to. There were moments when I wrote out long messages explaining everything and then deleted them. Megan kept telling me that I didn't need to win every conversation. She was right. The more I talked, the more opportunities there were for somebody to twist my words, so I stayed quiet. Then something happened that changed everything. The attorney's office contacted me. They had discovered that someone had attempted to obtain a copy of my trust documents. The request had been made using information that only my father should have had. The request wasn't successful, but the attorney wanted to know whether I had authorized anyone. I hadn't. I told them I hadn't. They advised me to put a written instruction in my file that no information about my trust could be released to anyone without my direct authorization. I did. I also changed passwords on my financial accounts. I froze my credit temporarily. I checked my credit report. Nothing had been opened in my name. That was a relief. It also made me realize how far this could have gone. My dad wasn't just pressuring me. He had tried to access information he had no right to have. A month later, my grandmother's estate finally closed. My mother received her inheritance. My uncle received his. The attorney sent me a final accounting because the trust had been connected to some of the estate administration. That accounting included a letter from my grandmother that I had never seen. It was addressed to both my brother and me. I read it alone. She wrote about how different we were. She said I tended to save money because uncertainty made me uncomfortable. She said Ethan tended to spend money because he hated feeling limited. She didn't criticize either of us. Then she wrote that she hoped we would never confuse love with financial rescue. That sentence stayed with me. She said helping someone didn't always mean giving them what they wanted. Sometimes it meant allowing them to experience the consequences of their choices while still being there when they were ready to change. I cried when I read that, not because it solved anything. It didn't. It just made me realize that my grandmother had seen our family more clearly than I had. My dad eventually asked me to meet him. We met at a diner on a weekday morning. He looked older. He said he regretted how he handled the bachelor party. He admitted he shouldn't have announced anything publicly. I asked whether he regretted trying to access my trust. He said he had only been trying to help Ethan. I told him that wasn't what I asked. He admitted it was wrong. That was probably the closest thing to an apology I was going to get. He said he thought I had become obsessed with money. I told him I had become protective of my boundaries. He said he had always believed brothers should help each other. I agreed. Then I explained that helping Ethan by paying off his debt would have allowed him to avoid dealing with the reason he was in debt. My dad didn't like that, but he understood it, at least somewhat. He told me he had borrowed money from his own retirement account to help with the wedding. I hadn't known that. He had also put several $1,000s on a home equity line. That explained why he had been so desperate. He wasn't just worried about Ethan. He was worried about the consequences of admitting that he couldn't rescue him. I asked him whether Ethan knew. He said no. I told him he needed to tell him. My dad said that wasn't my business. I agreed. For once, I left it there. Several months passed. Ethan and his fiancée eventually got married in a much smaller ceremony. There was no expensive honeymoon. They spent a long weekend at a modest hotel a few hours away. I helped them move some furniture into their new apartment after the wedding. I gave them a set of kitchen knives as a wedding present. They were not expensive. Ethan laughed when he opened them. He said they were probably the most practical wedding gift anyone had given him. I told him that was the point. He had started making real progress on his debt. Not huge progress, real progress. He had stopped using credit cards. He had negotiated lower payments on some accounts. He was still working weekends. His wife was helping too. Their relationship wasn't perfect, They argued about money. They had to cancel plans. They stopped eating out. They started using a written budget, but they were honest with each other. That mattered more than the honeymoon ever would have. My relationship with Ethan slowly improved. There was still awkwardness. Sometimes we would be talking and money would come up, and we would both become uncomfortable. But he eventually apologized. He said he had been embarrassed that I had more financial stability, and he had convinced himself that meant I owed him help. I told him I understood. I also told him I needed him to understand that I loved him regardless. He did. My relationship with my mother improved too. She admitted she had spent years trying to keep peace between my dad and Ethan. She said she had mistaken avoiding conflict for solving problems. I told her I had done something similar. I had spent years avoiding arguments with my family because I didn't want to be the difficult son. That was probably the hardest thing for me to admit. I had allowed some of this because I wanted everyone to think I was easygoing. I had laughed off comments about money. I had ignored favoritism. I had paid for dinners when I didn't want to. I had loaned Ethan money before, not huge amounts, a few $100s here, 1,000 there. I never expected repayment because I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. Looking back, I had helped create a pattern. I wasn't responsible for what my dad did, but I was responsible for the boundaries I hadn't set. My dad took longer. He still believed I had handled things badly. We didn't speak for nearly 6 months. Then my mother called me one Sunday. She said Dad wanted to see me. I almost said no. Instead, I agreed. We met at my parents' house. My dad had a stack of papers on the kitchen table. I thought they were financial documents. They weren't. They were the receipts and records from everything he had spent trying to help Ethan. He had gone through them himself. He had finally added up the damage. He had spent nearly $40,000. Most of it had gone toward wedding expenses and debt payments. Some had gone toward the failed business. He had been paying bills that weren't his. He said he finally understood that he hadn't been helping Ethan. He had been keeping Ethan from seeing the problem. I didn't know what to say. My dad apologized. This time it sounded different. He didn't say he was sorry for embarrassing me. He said he was sorry for treating me like a resource instead of his son. That sentence stayed with me. I told him I was sorry too. He looked surprised. I said I was sorry that I had spent so much time assuming he would never understand my point of view. He smiled a little. We weren't magically close again, but something changed. He stopped asking about my trust. He stopped discussing my finances with relatives. He stopped telling people that I owed Ethan help. And most importantly, he started letting Ethan handle his own problems. There was one final piece of the story that I didn't find out until almost a year later. Ethan called me one night. He said he had received a letter from the attorney who managed the trust. He had asked whether he could access more of his own trust funds to pay down his debt. The attorney had reviewed the request. The answer was yes within the terms of the trust. Ethan had enough money available to make a significant payment, but he chose not to take the full amount. He used a smaller distribution to pay off his highest interest credit card debt and kept the rest invested. I asked why. He said he wanted to prove to himself that he could fix the problem without draining everything. That made me proud of him. Not because he had finally used the trust, because he had finally understood what the money was for. It wasn't there to erase consequences. It was there to give him a chance to build something stable. He eventually paid off the remaining credit cards, then the personal loans. The business debt took longer. His wife became pregnant about 2 years after the wedding. By then they had a budget, an emergency fund, and no credit card balance. They still weren't rich. Neither was I. But they were okay. My dad became the kind of grandfather who brought too many snacks to every family gathering. He was still stubborn. He still gave unsolicited advice. He still occasionally said things that made everybody at the table look at each other. But he learned to ask before assuming. That was enough for me. The trust itself became almost boring. Every year I received a statement. I read it. I filed it. I didn't tell anyone the balance. I didn't tell my brother. He never asked. That was another sign that things had changed. For a long time, I thought the most important moment in all of this was when I stood up at the bachelor party and told everyone I wasn't paying for the honeymoon. It wasn't. The important moment happened later, sitting at my kitchen table with my brother and a calculator, when he finally admitted he didn't know how much debt he had. That was when the real problem became visible. The honeymoon was just the excuse. The trust was just the money. The actual problem was that my family had gotten used to solving discomfort by moving it around. If Ethan was in trouble, Dad paid. If Dad ran out of money, he looked at me. If I refused, somebody tried to make me feel guilty. Nobody had stopped to ask whether the solution actually fixed anything. I also learned that evidence isn't always about preparing for a courtroom. Sometimes documentation is just a way to keep yourself grounded when everyone around you remembers events differently. I kept the text messages because I was worried I would start doubting myself. I kept the trust letter because my grandmother had specifically warned me about pressure. I kept the financial documents because facts were easier to deal with than accusations. I never had to use most of them. That was probably the best outcome. There was no dramatic court case. No one got arrested. Nobody lost a house. There wasn't some huge public humiliation where my dad admitted everything in front of the entire family. The truth came out slowly. It came out through paperwork, uncomfortable conversations, bank statements, and people finally admitting things they had been hiding. That was much less satisfying than revenge. It was also much more real. The bachelor party itself became a family joke eventually. Ethan now calls it the most expensive dinner he never got. My dad refuses to talk about it unless somebody else brings it up. My mother laughs whenever the subject comes up. I don't really laugh. I remember how embarrassed I felt. I remember sitting there while 23 people stared at me because my father had announced that I was giving my brother something I had never agreed to give. I remember driving home afterward and wondering whether I had been too harsh. I remember checking my bank account even though I knew I hadn't transferred anything. I remember sitting in the dark and thinking that maybe keeping peace really was worth giving up a little money. Then I remembered my grandmother's letter. She had written that love and financial rescue were not the same thing. I think about that line whenever I feel guilty for saying no. I've said no a lot more since then, not just to my family, to coworkers who ask me to cover shifts, to friends who want loans, to relatives who assume I'll pay because I make slightly more than they do. Sometimes I still feel guilty. That's probably never going away completely. But guilt doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. Sometimes it just means you care about people and still have boundaries. Ethan and I are closer now than we were before the bachelor party. That sounds backward, but I think we finally stopped pretending with each other. He doesn't call me when he needs money. He calls me when he needs advice. Sometimes I don't have the answer. Sometimes I tell him to talk to someone who does. And sometimes he tells me I'm being annoying. Honestly, that's probably the healthiest our relationship has ever been. My dad and I aren't as close as we were when I was younger. I don't think we ever will be. There is still a piece of trust that didn't come back. I can forgive him for what he did. I'm not sure I'll ever forget that he tried to turn my own family into an audience for a financial decision I had never made. But forgiveness doesn't require pretending something didn't happen. It just means I don't need to punish him forever for it. The last time I saw the folder with the trust letter, it was sitting in a filing cabinet. I almost threw it away. Instead, I put it back, not because I expect another family crisis. I just like having the record. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had simply paid for the honeymoon. Maybe the wedding would have happened on schedule. Maybe Ethan's wife wouldn't have learned about the debt until later. Maybe they would have gone on the trip, posted pictures, and everyone would have pretended everything was fine. Then the credit card bills would still have arrived. The business debt would still have existed. My dad's retirement account would still have been smaller. The home equity loan would still have needed to be paid. And eventually someone would have asked me for more money because the honeymoon was never the solution. It was just the next thing my family thought they could make me responsible for. I still have the trust letter, the one I brought to the bachelor party, the one I never actually needed to read aloud. My dad never got to the part of the folder where the attorney explained the separate trusts. He didn't need to. The fact that I had brought documentation at all was enough to make him realize I wasn't going to argue about memories or feelings. I was going to stick to facts. I didn't bring it because I wanted to embarrass him. I brought it because I was tired of being told that I had promised things I hadn't promised. That night taught me something I wish I had learned much earlier. You don't always need to fight the person who is trying to manipulate you. Sometimes you just need to stop helping them rewrite reality. I didn't save my brother with a honeymoon. I didn't punish my father. I didn't win a courtroom battle. I didn't even get the apology I wanted at first. I just said no, kept the paperwork, and refused to let someone else's emergency become my obligation. In the end, that was enough. And honestly, seeing my brother sit at his own kitchen table years later, paying off his own debt and planning for his own future, felt like a much better fresh start than any honeymoon I could have bought.